Hi, I'm Pittaway, and I'll be talking about ostrich farming in South Africa with the focus on transitional vulnerabilities. This video is part of a series of videos about transitional vulnerabilities, and I will also be leaving some resources at the end of this bottom of this video for you to look at. So let's begin. So the background is that I was in the ostrich industry in South Africa, and part of my experience in that industry was that it had a very long monopoly, and it was actually only a small part of farmers that farmed it and knew how to farm it over a period of time until it became deregulated. And this became a strong interest for me about how the new farmers coming into the system, how did they get a footing into this? And they were vulnerable in this space. And so I refer to them as emerging ostrich farmers. These are the new farmers coming after deregulation and trying to find a foothold in this. What were the challenges? What were their vulnerabilities that actually then compounded in this space? What were the vulnerabilities that changed? There were some latent vulnerabilities which then actually become really problematic ones. So a lot of the people were from subsistence background and then kind of thrown into intensive type of farming, which they also did not have any experience with, and also they had to also farm with a global export thinking, which also means high quality standards, timing programs, and so the EU standards for meat, for example, and leather and tanning procedures was also really high tech for a lot of these farmers. So this does come from my PhD, and I studied over 4 types of case studies, but in this one I will only be looking at 2. And to answer the question, or what our question is in this study now, and in this video, is how do these latent vulnerabilities transform into catastrophic problems when some critical thresholds are crossed? And so we speak about in this series about this threshold where vulnerabilities cross into a critical space where it becomes really problematic. So ostrich farming, just to give a quick background to the production line and the production cycle, it's complicated. It starts off with eggs like chickens, and then in the production space they put them in artificial incubators where they're exposed to heat to accelerate and to keep consistent with regard to the hatching. And then the small ostriches are then grown or in growing farms. This is actually quite a vulnerable stage when they are small. They're very susceptible to disease and very susceptible to stress. So it is intensive type of farming. They grow them to approximately 8 to 12 months, 14 months, depending on what the market requires. And what is unique about this livestock is that it's used for meat, for leather, and for feathers, which is rather unique. And it's a red meat, which is also something unusual. We always think of chickens being white meat, but ostrich is red meat. So just give a little bit more detail on this production cycle and this value chain. The incubation of eggs up to 42 days. It needs electronic hatches. These are massive machines which require quite a bit of electricity. The first 3 months of the ostrich growing up to 10 to 14 months, they call it a slaughter weight of ideally 90 kilograms. So their feeding is really important. How they are fed to get them up to the weight, just like the chicken and poultry farming, it's the same kind of concept. Now the food is 80% of the total cost of it. So what they feed these ostriches, the quality of the food is actually very expensive, and that is also part of the growing process, is to get the right food into them. So what is required for this value chain for export? First of all, the animals, or the meat, there is a 14-day isolation period, and this is really important when it comes to bird flu. It is mandatory to make sure that everything is tested and according to the export status. And as I've mentioned before, they're culled for their meat, skins, and feathers. Birds are transported to the EU approved facilities. So again, the facilities and the abattoirs have to be EU approved. The 30-stage process when it comes to tanning, very complicated process of how the leather actually goes through the crusting phase, and how the colors and the tannins are actually attached to the drums, and the chemicals and the recipe within those drums is to a certain extent is a almost like a Coca-Cola secret in some areas. Not many people know how to tan ostrich leather that gets to the right quality needed for, let's say, footwear and for the handbag market. 90% of ostrich products is exported. There isn't really a local demand in South Africa. So like for our cattle and for our chickens, there's always a good local demand, but this is what makes it really fascinating. When you're farming ostriches, you're farming predominantly for the export market overseas and predominantly for the EU market. So in my doctorate, I looked at these 5 case studies, and just for this video, I'll be looking at 2 of them, Pittaway Ostrich program and the Rockhurst Ostrich program, and just kind of digging into their vulnerabilities and actually what happened to these farms. So let's start with the Pittaway. This had systemic barriers. All right, there were 20 farmers. They were in a common land shared, and they were growing the ostriches. Remember, these ostriches now were given to them they'd already hatched. They were part of the production value chain. And the problem with this was that it took time after they're growing the ostriches for them to receive the money after selling them. All right, so there was a bit of a cash flow crisis in some cases with money was delayed. A lot of the farmers here averaged between 60 and 70 years old. So what they'd created, the government had created a space to try and create employment for the elderly segment of the farmers in that area. It became very mentor dependent. In other words, a lot of these farmers, like I said, were coming from subsistence background. They needed mentors. These mentors were pretty much there on a daily basis to try and help them identify problems, diseases, and when a mentor leaves and they haven't imparted the information and the people haven't adopted, there were a high turnover of these farmers. There's nobody really carrying this, known knowledge. And then the protocols for bird flu was really, really strict. And a lot of the farmers may have been actually not, let's say, educated in agriculture, and some may not even actually been able to read. So you can imagine, how do you get the farmer to actually get to the level of EU export status and understanding what is required, the administration that is required, the inoculation that is required, the feeding that is required. And so when it happened in 2011, there was a big bird flu outbreak, and with that, a lot of the export markets had closed, and these farmers were not getting paid for their birds. Their food stopped supply because they didn't have the cash flow, and so this became a kind of a snowballing problem. It became all of these small little vulnerabilities, and there was not knowing how to farm, maybe to a certain extent not being educated enough to farm. There was mentor dependency, there was a cash flow crisis, there was a grant dependency from the government, and then the bird flu hit. So you can see there was a kind of a chain reaction, and all of these vulnerabilities again compounded, and at the end of the day, they just couldn't. When the bird flu hit, they couldn't export. They had very little connection to the main core ostrich industry at the time. Where they were positioned, they were very far away from the tanneries. And even when they moved the birds or the smaller birds to their farm, there were long distances to be able to get. So in itself, they were dependent on the entire industry to supply them with the birds, and then they had to feed the birds up to a certain weight and try and sell them again. And so if these birds never arrived, or they weren't able to buy them because of food or for whatever reason, and if there was no export market, you could see how this compounded all these little vulnerabilities within this case study. The other one is Rockhurst. Yeah, we had 7 farmers, a large farm. The farm was purchased for 13 million rand. They had about a few goats on the side. The government supported them quite well. they had also been given these big incubators. So yeah, they try to cross over, not only just receiving the live birds, but hey, let's give them the eggs, let them hatch their eggs, and then also during the growing phase of the cycle. But here is where, when the incubator arrived, here is where the problem started. They realized the farm did not have the right electricity um, level to actually run these very, very hungry incubators. So the incubators, they didn't work. It was a non-start situation. And so when they did eventually get some birds to get them going, a lot of the farmers, well, again, did not have the kind of entrepreneurial mindset to be able to work this farm and actually, build it up. And so there was no long-term investment incentive. So it was a very short-term kind of thinking when it came to these farmers. So this built the kind of the culture in this space. So they were off to a bad start because with the electricity. They were leasing this land at one stage, but then the government put a lot of investment in with regard to the land and the incubators, but at the end of the day couldn't actually go beyond the space. So no electricity, there's no incubation, there was insufficient revenue again and turnover, and they couldn't buy electricity at certain points of the time. And I think again, you know, this type of farming with exotic livestock was really too complicated for these farmers in this area. But small vulnerabilities led to a complete collapse in this farming. So if we look at the framework here, there are latent vulnerabilities in each of these case studies. All right. In other words, they didn't realize that how important the electricity was in the one case. The others didn't realize how important or realize the vulnerability of being so far away from some of the tanneries and the abattoirs was also a problem with regard to putting too much stress on the livestock with regard to transport. So there were these small vulnerabilities that kind of got exposed over time. They compounded, amplified it, and reached a threshold. Unfortunately, both of those case studies, those farms, did not make it, and they were closed. So that is just a quick analogy, just a kind of an example of two case studies of small vulnerabilities with each of these farms and how they actually led to a complete collapse at the end of the day. So this entire thesis is available for you to download on the link below.